We are often taught that the death of an empire is a loud, chaotic spectacle of fire and steel. But hidden behind the shattered mosaics of Constantinople lay a darkness far more intimate. A quiet terror where a 15-year-old princess disguised in soot and rags awaited a verdict worse than death. This is the untold story of Theodora Palaiologina. On the 29th of May, 1453, the unbreakable Theodosian walls finally crumbled, allowing Sultan Mehmed II to step over the corpse of Byzantium and into the pages of legend. Yet, amidst the smoke that choked the Golden Horn, the true test of his conquest was not military, but psychological. Decided not on the battlefield, but in the suffocating silence of a blood-stained throne room. If you dare to witness the history they tried to bury, strike the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me, from which city are you observing the past today? In the spring of 1453, the air surrounding the ancient capital of the Roman Empire did not smell of blooming flowers or the salt of the Sea of Marmara, but rather it reeked of a distinct metallic sharpness. The scent of sulfur and impending doom. For 57 days, the sun rose not to illuminate the glory of Constantinople, but to reveal the widening cracks in walls that had stood defiant for over a millennium. Imagine, if you will, the psychological torture of listening to a countdown. Not measured in seconds, but in the thunderous rhythm of stone slamming against stone. The Ottomans had brought with them a weapon of such nightmarish proportions that the defenders on the walls crossed themselves merely at the sight of it. It was the basilic. A cannon, 27 feet in length, cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban, who had ironically offered his services to the Christians first, only to be turned away by an emperor whose treasury was as empty as his hopes. Now that same genius was turned against them, when the great beast of bronze finally spoke, clearing its throat with a thunderous roar that shattered windows 3 miles away. The very earth beneath Constantinople seemed to tremble in terror. The stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds didn't merely hit the Theodosian walls. They pulverized history itself, turning the intricate limestone and brickwork into clouds of choking red dust. For the 7,000 defenders inside the city, a pitiful number compared to the 80,000 Ottoman warriors waiting outside, this sound became the heartbeat of their nightmares. It was a constant reminder that the world they knew, the world of classical learning and orthodox piety and imperial grandeur, was being systematically dismantled one stone at a time. Emperor Constantine XI, the last of the Caesars, walked these crumbling ramparts like a ghost haunting his own grave. He was 48 years old, yet his eyes carried the exhaustion of centuries. He knew with the cold clarity of a man who has stared into the abyss that no help was coming from the west. The ships from Venice were delayed. The armies of the Pope remained indifferent, entangled in their own political webs. Constantinople was alone, and in the shadowed corridors of the palace of the Porphyrogenitus, the residence of the imperial family. This loneliness manifested as a suffocating silence. It is here in these marble halls that we find our protagonist. Not a soldier clutching a spear, but a 15-year-old girl named Theodora Palaiologina. History books often reduce her to a footnote, a name on a genealogy chart. But let us anchor ourselves in her reality for a moment. She was not merely a princess. She was a child of the purple, born into a lineage that traced its authority back to Augustus himself. She had been educated in the finest libraries, reading Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek. Yet all the philosophy in the world could not explain why her universe was ending. Imagine being 15 years old and watching your mother, the Lady Euprosin, methodically burning the family archives in the fireplace, the smell of burning parchment, centuries of letters and deeds curling into black ash. Must have been nauseating. They were destroying their past to prevent the Ottomans from defiling it. Theodora would have watched the firelight dancing in her mother's eyes, seeing not fear, but a grim determination. The servants had already fled, or were busy sewing gold coins into the hems of their garments, hoping to buy their lives when the inevitable happened. But for a princess, there is no buying one's way out. The unspoken rule of medieval warfare hung over the palace like a shroud. If the city surrendered, mercy might be shown. But if the city fell by force, if the sword had to be drawn to take the gates, then the laws of God and man were suspended for 3 days. 3 days of unrestricted rights for the victors. Theodora knew what this meant. She had heard the whispers of the court ladies, their voices trembling as they spoke of the fate of women in captured cities. It was not death they feared most, but the loss of dignity, the transformation from a noble woman into a mere object of commerce to be traded in the slave markets of the East. To survive, she would have to cease being Theodora. In the days leading up to the final assault, she began the process of erasing herself. She stopped wearing the silks and brocades that marked her station. Instead, she scoured the kitchens, finding rough wool tunics stained with grease and soot. She rubbed ash into her fair skin and chopped her hair. That long dark hair that had been brushed 100 times a night by handmaidens. She hacked it off with a rusted knife until she looked like a jagged reflection of a street urchin. This was not a game of dress-up. This was a desperate bid for invisibility. Outside the walls, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Sultan Mehmed, the 21-year-old ambition made flesh, was growing impatient. His own viziers were whispering of retreat, fearing that a Christian relief force might arrive at any moment. But Mehmed was driven by a hunger that went beyond territory. He slept with the histories of Alexander the Great under his pillow. He did not want to just defeat the Romans. He wanted to absorb them. He famously declared that there could be only one empire, one faith, and one sovereignty in the world. On the evening of May 28th, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and blood red, the Ottoman camp fell into a sudden and terrifying silence. The cannons stopped. The drums ceased. It was the deep breath before the scream. Inside the city, the silence was even worse. It was the silence of a patient who has been told the disease is terminal. In the palace, Theodora sat by a window, the rough wool of her disguise scratching against her skin. She could see the thousands of campfires lighting up the plains outside the walls, a sea of stars that had fallen to earth to consume them. Her mother approached her, her face pale and drawn, and placed a small vial in her hand. It was not poison, for suicide was a mortal sin in the eyes of the church, but a small crucifix of iron. Pray, her mother would have whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. Pray not for victory, for that belongs to God, but for the strength to endure what comes after. The concept of what comes after is crucial here. We often view historical events as singular points in time. A battle is won or lost. A king is crowned or killed. But for the people living through it, time stretches and distorts. For Theodora, those final hours must have felt like a lifetime. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like an invading footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a scream. The psychological burden of waiting for the inevitable is often more damaging than the event itself. She was a bird trapped in a gilded cage, knowing that the cats were circling outside, scratching at the door, and the lock was breaking. And then, just after midnight, the silence was shattered, not by cannons this time, but by the human voice. 80,000 men roaring in unison. A sound so powerful, it was said to have drowned out the thunder of the heavens. The ground shook not from impact, but from the sheer acoustic force of the war cry. The final assault had begun. In the palace, Theodora blew out the candle, plunging her room into darkness. She was no longer a princess. She was a ghost in the making, waiting for the dawn that would bring fire and blood. As the midnight hour approached, a strange phenomenon occurred within the besieged city. The ancient bells of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, began to toll, not with the rhythmic precision of liturgy, but with the frantic, desperate clamour of a drowning man calling for aid. For the first time in centuries, the theological schisms that had divided East and West, the bitter arguments over the nature of the Holy Spirit and the authority of the Pope, evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Faced with the absolute certainty of death, Catholics and Orthodox Christians flowed together into the great cathedral. Imagine the sensory overload of that moment. The air was thick with the scent of frankincense, burning in gold thuribles. A heavy sweet smoke meant to carry prayers to heaven. But tonight, it mixed with the metallic tang of fear that sweated from the pores of thousands. Under the vast golden dome which seemed to float above them like a suspended heaven, Emperor Constantine XI stood before the altar. Historical accounts from George Sphrantzes, his loyal friend and chronicler, describe a scene of heart-wrenching pathos. The emperor, the representative of God on earth, asked forgiveness from his subjects. From the lowest scullery maid to the highest general, he bowed low, shedding the arrogance of his office, and embraced them as equals in mortality. Somewhere in that crushing throng of weeping humanity, Theodora would have been kneeling. Her rough woolen disguise could not shield her from the collective grief of a dying civilization. She would have heard the low hum of the Kyrie eleison, "Lord, have mercy," rising from 10,000 throats. A sonic vibration so intense it must have felt as if the very mosaics were vibrating in sympathy. But mercy was a commodity in short supply that night, outside the walls. The Ottoman drums began a new rhythm, faster, louder, a heartbeat accelerating into cardiac arrest. Sultan Mehmed unleashed his forces in waves, a cruel but brilliant strategy calculated to grind the defenders into dust through sheer exhaustion. First came the irregulars, the Bashi bazooks, expendable troops sent forward to absorb the arrows and boiling oil. They died by the thousands, their screams weaving a tapestry of horror that echoed through the dark. Then came the Anatolian regulars, disciplined and fierce, and finally, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon on the morning of May 29th, Mehmed played his final card, the Janissaries. These were not mere soldiers, they were the Sultan's personal harvest. Taken as children from Christian families, converted, and forged into the finest killing machines of the medieval world. They advanced not with wild shouts, but with a terrifying disciplined silence, accompanied only by the martial music of pipes and drums that signalled the end of days. On the walls, the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, the man who had been the backbone of the defence, was suddenly struck, a projectile. Some say a bullet from a primitive arquebus. Others say a quarrel from a crossbow pierced his armour. The sight of their invincible commander bleeding, broken, and being carried away on a stretcher was the psychological blow that shattered the defender's will. It is often said that battles are decided not by the number of dead, but by the moment hope dies in the hearts of the living. For Constantinople, that was the moment, and then The unthinkable. A small postern gate known as the Kerkerporta, usually kept locked and barred, was found ajar. Was it treachery? Was it simple human error born of fatigue? History does not say, but the Ottomans saw the opening. Like water finding a crack in a dam, they poured through. The cry went up. A sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The city is taken. The city is taken. He tore off his imperial ornaments, the purple cloak that marked him as a target, and drew his sword. The city is fallen, and I am still alive, he shouted, before charging headlong into the crimson tide of the enemy. He was never seen again. Some say he died instantly. Others say he was buried under a mountain of corpses, anonymous in death as he could never be in life. The last Caesar of Rome vanished not into a tomb, but into the chaotic memory of his people. With the walls breached, the laws of civilization were suspended. We must pause here to understand the brutal context of 15th century warfare. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the standard currency of motivation for medieval armies. The soldiers had been promised 3 days of pillage, a period where the normal rules of conduct were dissolved. For the citizens of Constantinople, this meant that the sanctity of their homes, the holiness of their churches, and the safety of their bodies were no longer guaranteed. The descriptions of what followed are difficult to read even after 500 years. The streets became a theatre of tragedy. Men were cut down where they stood. The elderly were pushed aside or dispatched as liabilities. But the true currency of the day was not gold or jewels. It was human beings. Theodora, hiding in the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, would have heard the storm approaching. It didn't sound like battle anymore. It sounded like a hunt. The heavy thud of boots kicking open doors, the shattering of porcelain, the ripping of tapestries, and the screams, distinct, individual screams that were abruptly silenced. She had squeezed herself into a storage room, behind heavy clay amphorae filled with olive oil. The smell of the oil, pungent and earthy, mixed with the stale air of the confined space. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sounds of the sack. But the imagination is often louder than reality. She would have known that just a few floors away, her life as she knew it was being dismantled. The great palace, a structure that had rivaled the heavens for beauty, was being stripped bare. Soldiers tore icons from the walls to pry out the gemstones. They chopped up holy relics to share the gold casings. The library, containing the accumulated wisdom of Greece and Rome, was torched, or the parchments were sold for pennies to buy bread. It was a cultural lobotomy, a frantic erasure of 1,000 years of history. As the hours dragged on, the footsteps drew closer to her hiding place. The door to the storage room creaked open. A shaft of light cut through the dusty darkness, illuminating the floating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. Theodora held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was small. She was dirty. She looked nothing like a princess. But the soldiers who entered were thorough. They were looking for anything of value. And in the economy of conquest, a young girl, regardless of her dress, had value. A rough hand grabbed her shoulder. She was dragged out into the corridor, blinking in the harsh light. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She remembered her mother's words. Endure. She made herself limp, passive, eyes cast down. The soldiers argued over her in a language she understood, but pretended not to. Turkish. They debated whether to take her to the slave markets immediately, or to keep her for themselves. But then, an officer arrived, a man of higher rank, distinguishable by the quality of his armor and the authoritative tone of his voice. He saw something in her. Perhaps it was the way she held herself despite the rags, a subtle defiance in her posture that betrayed her noble breeding. Or perhaps it was simply fate intervening in the form of bureaucracy. He ordered her to be taken not to the camps, but to the holding area for high-value captives. The distinction saved her life. But it condemned her to a different kind of terror. She was marched through the ruined streets, forced to step over the bodies of men she might have known. Servants, guards, distant cousins. The city was burning. Great plumes of black smoke rising to choke the sky, turning the sun into a bloodshot eye staring down at the carnage. She was brought to the great square before the Hagia Sophia, now a holding pen for the aristocracy, and there, amidst the weeping ruins of her class, she waited for the conqueror to arrive. The man who had orchestrated this symphony of destruction was coming to survey his prize, and Theodora, the last daughter of Byzantium, was about to meet the wolf of the Ottomans. While Theodora waited in the shadows of captivity, the architect of her world's destruction made his entrance. Sultan Mehmed II rode into the city not on a chariot of fire, but on a white Arabian stallion. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. When he arrived at the bronze doors, battered but still standing, he did something that confused his soldiers and fascinated historians for centuries. He dismounted, he bent down, gathered a handful of dust from the street, and poured it over his turban. It was a profound Islamic gesture of humility, a reminder that all glory belongs to God, and that even the greatest conqueror is but dust in the wind. He entered the cathedral, walking across the marble floors where emperors had been crowned for a millennium. He gazed up at the figure of Christ Pantocrator in the dome, staring back at him with eternal judgment. Mehmed did not order the mosaics destroyed. He did not order the building razed. Instead, he ordered the call to prayer. In that moment, the Hagia Sophia transformed. It was no longer the heart of Byzantium. It was the beating heart of a new Ottoman Empire. But Mehmed noticed something else. As he looked around the city, he saw the smoke, the looting, the structural damage caused by his own army's enthusiasm. And he realized a terrifying truth. If he let the 3 days of pillage continue, he would be the emperor of a graveyard. He needed a capital, not a ruin. He needed subjects to tax, not corpses to bury. So, defying the very expectations of his troops, and risking a mutiny, he ordered the looting stopped after only 1 day. It was a decision of cold political calculus, and it was this same calculus that would decide the fate of the girl trembling in the palace. Theodora was dragged from the holding area back to the place of her birth, the palace of the Porphyrogenitus, but it was a twisted parody of the home she knew. The windows were smashed, the tapestries were gone, the air smelled of stale sweat, wet boots, and blood. She was shoved into the throne room. It was crowded with Ottoman generals, men with beards thick with dust, their armor still stained from the morning's butchery, and sitting there, on a portable camp throne that looked absurdly small in the vast hall, was the boy Sultan. He was only 21, barely 6 years older than Theodora herself. He wore a robe of white silk, pristine and terrifyingly clean amidst the filth of war. On his head sat a turban wound around a red cap, pinned with a jeweled agate that caught the dying light of the afternoon sun. His eyes, described by the chronicler Kritoboulos as piercing and restless, scanned the prisoners. When Theodora was pushed forward, the room went silent. Picture the contrast, a conqueror at the height of his power, and a princess disguised as a scullery maid, her face smeared with soot, her hands shaking uncontrollably. By all the laws of conquest, she was his property. His commanders stood with arms crossed, smirking, expecting the Sultan to claim her for his harem, or perhaps to hand her over to a favored general as a reward. It was the brutal predictability of war. The weaker meat for the strong. Mehmed leaned forward. He did not speak in Turkish. He spoke in fluent Greek. "You are of the Palaiologos line," he stated. It wasn't a question. Theodora, realizing that her disguise had failed, that her posture or perhaps the softness of her hands had betrayed her, nodded. "I am," she whispered. "Where is your father?" "He died defending the city," she replied. Her voice was faint, but it did not break. The Sultan studied her. He looked at the soot on her face, the rough wool scratching her skin. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the dignity. He asked one final question, a question that seemed utterly bizarre in a room that smelled of slaughter. "Can you read?" It was a test. A servant might be beautiful, but a princess carried the intellectual weight of an empire. Theodora answered in the affirmative. She could read Greek, Latin, and even some Arabic, the language of her enemy. The room held its breath. The executioner stood ready. The harem guards stood ready. And then Mehmed the Conqueror delivered his verdict. Release her. The shock in the room must have been palpable. A murmur of confusion rippled through the ranks of the Janissaries, but Mehmed raised a hand, silencing them. He didn't stop there. He ordered that Theodora be granted her freedom immediately, not as a slave, not as a concubine, but as a noblewoman under the protection of the state. He assigned her a residence in the Fana district, gave her a stipend from the imperial treasury, and, most shockingly of all, granted her the right to practice her Christian faith openly. Why? Why would a man who had just unleashed hell on her city show such inexplicable mercy? Western historians for centuries tried to bury this story, or paint it as a momentary lapse of judgment. But the truth is far more fascinating. This was not kindness. This was strategy. Mehmed did not view himself as a Turkish warlord destroying Rome. He viewed himself as inheriting it. He had taken the title Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, to be the legitimate emperor. He needed continuity. He needed the living symbols of the old regime to acknowledge his power, not from the grave, but from a position of gratitude, by sparing Theodora, by protecting the nobility who survived. He was sending a message to the world. He was not a barbarian at the gates. He was a civilized monarch, capable of magnanimitas, the ancient Roman virtue of greatness of soul. Theodora became a living propaganda piece for his new empire. She lived in Constantinople for several years, watching as her city transformed. She saw the minarets rising, yes, but she also saw the markets reopening. She saw the Sultan appointing a new Orthodox patriarch, Enintiu Gennadius Scholarius, ensuring that the Greek Church would survive under Ottoman rule. She witnessed the birth of a cosmopolitan society where different faiths lived side by side. Uneasy, perhaps, but alive. In 1456, records indicate she was permitted to leave the city. She traveled to the Peloponnese, where the last embers of Byzantine rule were fading out. She eventually married a minor noble, lived a quiet life far from the corridors of power, and died in obscurity around 1480. She never returned to the throne room. She never reclaimed her title, but she kept something far more valuable, her life and her dignity. The story of Theodora is a mirror. In it, we see the complexity of a man like Mehmed, who could order a massacre in the morning and discuss philosophy in the afternoon. And we see the resilience of a girl who, when the walls fell, found a way to stand amidst the rubble. She reminds us that in the darkest chapters of history, survival is often the only victory that matters. But the story does not end with a girl walking free into the smoking ruins of a conquered city. Theodora's survival was merely a microcosm of a much larger paradox. A strange irony that history often tries to hide behind the veil of nationalistic pride. By conquering Constantinople, Mehmed II didn't kill the Roman Empire. In a way, he saved it from the slow, agonizing death of irrelevance. For 2 centuries before the cannons fired, Byzantium had been a corpse waiting for a burial. It was bankrupt, torn apart by civil wars, and reduced to a city-state surrounded by hostile powers. By taking it, Mehmed injected it with the violent vitality of the Ottoman Turks. He rebuilt the walls. He repopulated the streets with people from across his vast domains. Jews, Christians, and Muslims living in an uneasy but productive tension. The Grand Bazaar rose from the ashes of the old forums, becoming the economic engine of the world. The city didn't die, it merely changed its clothes, trading the purple robes of the Caesars for the kaftan of the sultans. And what of the knowledge, what of the soul of Byzantium? When the walls fell, it triggered one of the greatest intellectual migrations in human history. Thousands of scholars, scribes, and artists, seeing the writing on the wall, fled west. They carried with them the precious cargo that Theodora's mother had tried to burn. The manuscripts of Plato, of Homer, of Aristotle, in the original Greek. They landed in Italy, in Florence, in Venice, in Rome, and there they planted the seeds of the ancient world into the fertile soil of Western Europe. Historians call this the Renaissance. Think about the terrifying beauty of that connection. The cannonballs that shattered the Theodosian walls also shattered the medieval stagnation of Europe. If Constantinople had not fallen, if Mehmed had been turned back, the Italian Renaissance might never have happened with such intensity. Michelangelo might never have painted the Sistine Chapel. The modern world as we know it, born from the rediscovery of classical logic and science, owes its existence to the tragedy of May 29th. Civilization, it seems, is a phoenix that can only rise from the ashes of disaster. But let us return one last time to the human element, to the girl who lived. Theodora Palaiologina died in obscurity, far from the throne that should have been hers, but her silence speaks louder than the roar of Orban's cannon. We are often addicted to the stories of heroes who die gloriously in battle. Like Constantine XI charging into the fray, we build statues for them, we write songs about them, but we rarely honor the courage of those who choose to survive. Survival is not glamorous. It requires compromise. It requires swallowing one's pride. It requires wearing the clothes of a servant and kneeling before the man who destroyed your world. But it is the survivors who carry the memory. It is the survivors who keep the culture alive in the whispers to their children. Theodora did not defeat Mehmed with a sword. She defeated him by denying him the satisfaction of her death. She denied him the erasure of her lineage. As you sit there, perhaps in the safety of your own home, listening to this echo from 500 years ago, ask yourself this. We all have walls that we think are unbreakable. We all have comforts we think will last forever. But history is a cruel teacher. It shows us that even the eternal city, the city of God, can fall in a single morning. If you stood in that throne room, with the smell of blood in the air and the eyes of a conqueror boring into your soul, would you have the courage to die like an emperor? Or would you have the strength to live like a princess? Sometimes, the hardest thing to do isn't to let go, it's to hold on. When there is nothing left to hold on to, the lights of Constantinople have gone out, the incense has faded, but in the darkness, if you listen closely, You can still hear the breathing of those who refuse to expire. Until we meet again in the archives.